Something strange began happening the moment researchers stopped treating emotion as a poetic idea and started measuring it like a biological force. Beneath hospital monitors, inside neuroscience labs, and across decades of psychological studies, patterns emerged that nobody could comfortably ignore. Human emotion was not simply coloring our experience of life. It was actively shaping the body, influencing perception, and altering the way we interact with the world around us. I remember reading about patients whose recovery times shifted dramatically depending on their emotional state. Two people could receive nearly identical treatment, yet the person who felt connected, hopeful, and emotionally supported often healed faster. At first, many scientists dismissed these outcomes as coincidence or placebo. But the deeper the research went, the harder it became to separate biology from emotion. The human body, it turns out, is listening constantly. Every thought we repeat, every stress we carry, every moment of gratitude or fear sends chemical signals through an invisible internal network. Hormones rise and fall, neural pathways strengthen, the immune system responds, even the rhythm of the heart changes according to emotional states. What once sounded philosophical suddenly became measurable. And that changes everything. For generations, ancient cultures described emotion as energy moving through the body. Modern science avoided language like that for a long time because it sounded too abstract, too mystical. Yet researchers eventually discovered that emotions create measurable electrical and chemical changes throughout the nervous system. Different emotional states produce different physiological patterns, almost like emotional fingerprints written into the biology itself. One study involving heart rhythm patterns caught my attention years ago. Researchers noticed that emotions such as appreciation and compassion created unusually coherent rhythms in the body, while prolonged anger and anxiety produced chaotic patterns associated with stress responses. What fascinated me was not the emotional discovery alone, it was the realization that the body reflects emotional experience with astonishing precision. We feel emotion physically because emotion is physical. Think about the last time fear hit you unexpectedly. Your stomach tightened before you consciously understood why. Your breathing shifted. Your muscles reacted. The body interpreted emotional information before language even entered the picture. In many ways, emotion may be one of the oldest intelligence systems humans possess. That idea becomes even more intriguing when we look at perception itself. Neuroscientists now understand that the brain is not simply recording reality like a camera, it is interpreting, filtering, and predicting reality based on internal states. Emotion influences what we notice, what we remember, and even how we define meaning. Two people can walk through the same experience and emerge with completely different realities because their emotional filters shape what becomes important. That realization stayed with me for weeks because it quietly challenged one of our deepest assumptions. Most of us believe we see the world exactly as it is, but what if we are seeing the world partly through the emotional atmosphere we carry inside ourselves? Suddenly, self-awareness becomes more than self-help language. It becomes a form of perception training. Researchers studying chronic stress uncovered something equally unsettling. The body does not always distinguish between an immediate physical threat and a vividly imagined emotional one. Repeated worry can trigger the same biological stress chemistry again and again, even while sitting safely inside a quiet room. Over time, that constant activation affects sleep, digestion, memory, inflammation, and overall health. The body believes what the mind repeatedly rehearses. But there is another side to this story that rarely receives enough attention. Positive emotional states are not merely pleasant experiences. They appear to influence resilience, creativity, social connection, and recovery in measurable ways. People who cultivate emotional balance often demonstrate stronger adaptability under pressure. Their nervous systems recover faster after stress. Their thinking becomes clearer. Their decision-making improves. None of this means human emotion is magic. It does not erase hardship or eliminate suffering. Reality remains complicated. Loss still hurts. Fear still exists. But science is beginning to confirm something deeply human that many people intuitively sensed long before laboratories existed. Emotion is not separate from the body or isolated from the mind. It is woven into nearly every aspect of human experience. And maybe that explains why certain moments change us forever. A conversation, a memory, A single unexpected act of kindness. Somehow, emotional experiences leave marks deeper than information alone. We rarely remember every statistic we hear, but we remember how particular moments felt inside us. Emotion gives memory its gravity. It tells the brain what matters enough to keep. Sometimes I wonder how different our lives would look if emotional awareness were treated with the same seriousness as physical fitness or intellectual development. We train muscles. We educate the mind. Yet many people move through life without ever learning how their emotional patterns quietly shape their health, relationships, and perception of reality. Perhaps the greatest discovery is not that emotion affects the body. Perhaps the real discovery is that human beings have always been far more interconnected internally than we realized. And the deeper scientists look into consciousness, biology, and perception, the more they uncover evidence that our inner world may be influencing far more than we ever suspected before the research began to reveal something unexpected. In controlled experiments, even brief moments of emotional regulation appeared to change attention, breathing patterns, and social behavior within minutes. That means the smallest internal shift may ripple outward into conversations, decisions, and experiences we barely notice forming in real time. A calmer mind can hear details that panic misses. A grateful state can soften reactions that once seemed automatic. Slowly, the evidence points toward a remarkable possibility. Human emotion may not simply respond to reality after events occur. It may participate in shaping the quality of the reality we experience while events are unfolding. And if that is true, then the next question becomes impossible to ignore, because researchers are now beginning to ask whether consciousness itself might operate more alike than a passive observer ever. Observer. Some researchers now compare consciousness to a field of interaction, something dynamic rather than isolated inside the skull. That comparison remains controversial, but the questions surrounding it are growing harder to dismiss. Why do emotional states alter our sense of time? Why does stress narrow awareness while calmness expands perception? And why do moments of deep emotional connection sometimes produce clarity that logic alone cannot explain? I remember speaking with a neurologist who described the brain less like a machine and more like an orchestra. Different systems synchronize constantly, exchanging signals through electrical pulses and chemical messengers. When emotional stress becomes chronic, that orchestra loses harmony. Certain regions become overactive while others weaken. Attention fragments, sleep deteriorates. The body shifts into survival mode. Yet the reverse also appears true. Practices that cultivate emotional regulation seem capable of restoring coherence throughout multiple systems at once. Slow breathing changes heart rhythms. Focused attention influences neural activity. Meaningful social connection lowers stress chemistry. Even brief periods of genuine appreciation can produce measurable physiological effects. Science is beginning to reveal that emotional balance is not merely psychological comfort, it is biological alignment. That idea becomes especially powerful when we examine human relationships. For years, researchers believed emotions were mostly private experiences contained within individuals. But modern studies suggest emotional states spread constantly between people through facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, and subtle nervous system responses. One anxious person can elevate tension across an entire room. One calm presence can quiet conflict without saying a word. We have all felt this without needing scientific confirmation. You walk into a conversation and instantly sense unease before anyone speaks, or you meet someone whose grounded presence makes you feel unexpectedly safe. Beneath language, human beings appear to communicate emotionally in ways we are only beginning to understand consciously. And maybe that explains why loneliness affects the body so deeply. Researchers studying isolation discovered that prolonged social disconnection can influence inflammation, stress hormones, and even cardiovascular health. Human beings are not designed for emotional separation over long periods of time. Connection is not simply emotional decoration layered onto survival. In many ways, connection is survival. That realization changes how we think about modern life. We live surrounded by information, yet often disconnected from ourselves. Notifications compete for attention every few seconds. Stress becomes normalized. Emotional exhaustion hides beneath productivity. Many people know how to operate devices more effectively than they understand their own nervous systems. The consequences are subtle at first. Patience shortens, sleep becomes shallow, moments blur together, people stop noticing how deeply constant emotional stimulation affects their thoughts and biology. The mind adapts to urgency until stillness itself feels uncomfortable. But something remarkable happens when people finally slow down long enough to observe their internal world clearly. At first, they notice noise, restlessness, unfinished thoughts moving in endless circles. Then gradually, beneath the mental turbulence, another layer emerges. Patterns become visible. Emotional reactions that once felt automatic begin revealing their origins. Old fears surface. Buried grief appears. Long ignored exhaustion finally speaks. This is where many people turn away, not because self-awareness lacks value, but because honest observation can feel uncomfortable before it becomes freeing. We spend years building identities around habits, emotional defenses, and familiar narratives. Seeing beyond those patterns requires courage. Yet neuroscience increasingly suggests that awareness itself changes the brain. The moment we observe a reaction consciously, we interrupt automatic loops. That interruption matters more than most people realize. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. The emotions we rehearse become easier to access over time. Stress can become habitual, so can resentment, so can hopelessness. But new emotional patterns can also be developed through repeated awareness and intentional practice. In other words, the brain remains adaptable far longer than scientists once believed. This concept, known as neuroplasticity, transformed modern neuroscience because it challenged the old assumption that the adult brain was mostly fixed. Experience reshapes the brain continuously. Thoughts matter, habits matter, emotional environments matter. Every repeated experience leaves traces within the nervous system. And suddenly, personal transformation no longer sounds abstract. It becomes biological reality. I find that deeply hopeful because it suggests human beings are not trapped permanently by past conditioning. Trauma influences us powerfully, but influence is not destiny. Emotional patterns learned through years of repetition can change through new experiences, supportive relationships, and intentional awareness. Even small shifts matter. A single moment of compassion can interrupt anger. One honest conversation can dissolve years of misunderstanding. A few minutes of silence can reveal emotions buried beneath distraction. Transformation rarely arrives all at once. More often, it unfolds through tiny internal adjustments repeated consistently over time. Still, one mystery continues to challenge researchers and philosophers alike. Why does conscious experience exist at all? We can measure brain activity, we can observe chemical changes, we can map neural networks with astonishing precision, yet the actual feeling of being aware remains strangely elusive. No scan fully explains why sadness feels heavy or why love alters the texture of experience itself. Science has uncovered mechanisms, but the deeper nature of consciousness still stands partly unexplained. And perhaps that uncertainty is important, because every major scientific breakthrough begins with the willingness to admit that reality may be larger than our current models. The deeper researchers explore emotion, perception, and consciousness, the more human experience appears interconnected in ways once considered impossible. Ancient observers sense fragments of this through introspection. Modern scientists are approaching similar questions through measurement and experimentation. Two paths moving toward the same horizon, which raises a possibility both unsettling and beautiful. What if emotional mastery is not about controlling feelings at all? What if it is about learning to listen carefully enough to understand what those feelings are revealing about the relationship between the mind, the body, and the reality unfolding around us before the next discovery changes everything once again? Because somewhere between biology and consciousness, humanity may be uncovering capacities that have remained hidden in plain sight forever. Forever. The most fascinating part is that these discoveries are not emerging from one isolated field. Neuroscience, psychology, biology, and consciousness research are slowly converging toward a shared realization that human experience cannot be fully understood by separating mind from body or emotion from perception. The divisions we created for convenience may not exist as cleanly in reality as we once assumed. I think that is why so many people feel a quiet sense of recognition when they hear these ideas, not because the concepts are entirely new, but because they resonate with something deeply familiar. Most people already know, at least intuitively, that emotional states affect the way life unfolds around them. We have all experienced days where stress distorted simple conversations into conflict, or moments where peace made ordinary experiences feel unexpectedly vivid. The difference now is that science is beginning to measure what human beings have sensed internally for generations. One area that continues to astonish researchers involves the relationship between expectation and physical response. In carefully controlled studies, people given harmless substances sometimes experienced real physiological improvements simply because they believed healing was possible. This phenomenon became so consistent that scientists were forced to take it seriously. Belief alone was influencing measurable biological outcomes. That does not mean the mind can override every physical condition. Reality is more complex than that. But it does suggest something extraordinary. The brain is not passively observing the body from a distance. It is participating in the body's responses continuously. And suddenly, the boundary between thought and biology becomes far less solid. I once read about a performance study involving athletes visualizing specific movements repeatedly without physically practicing them. Brain scans revealed that mental rehearsal activated many of the same neural circuits involved in actual performance. Even more surprising, measurable improvement followed in some cases despite minimal physical movement. The nervous system was responding to imagined experience almost as if it were real. Think about the implications of that for a moment. Every memory we replay emotionally, every fear we rehearse internally, every hopeful possibility we nurture may be shaping the nervous system in subtle ways long before external results appear. The stories we repeat inside ourselves become biological experiences over time. Maybe that explains why unresolved emotional pain can linger for years even after circumstances change. The body remembers patterns the conscious mind may no longer notice. A person who once lived through instability may continue reacting to harmless situations with anxiety long after danger disappears. Another person raised in emotionally supportive environments may move through uncertainty with far greater resilience. Beneath conscious awareness, emotional conditioning quietly influences perception, behavior, and physical response. Yet, researchers have also discovered that memory itself is less fixed than we once believed. Every time we recall a memory, the brain partially reconstructs it. Emotional interpretation influences how experiences are stored and reshaped over time. In a sense, human beings are continuously editing their relationship with the past through present awareness. That realization feels almost cinematic to me. We tend to think of identity as something permanent, a stable collection of memories and traits locked into place. But consciousness appears far more fluid. Human beings are constantly changing internally, even when external life looks the same. New insights alter old experiences. Emotional healing changes perception. Awareness transforms meaning. And meaning may be one of the most powerful forces of all. Psychologists studying resilience repeatedly found that people endure hardship more effectively when they can connect suffering to purpose, growth, or understanding. Two individuals may face similar challenges, yet the one who finds meaning within the struggle often demonstrates greater psychological recovery. The external event matters, but interpretation matters too. Emotion shapes interpretation. Interpretation shapes biology. Biology influences perception. Perception influences behavior. Everything connects. The deeper I explored this research, the harder it became to maintain the old mechanical view of human life. We are not machines processing information coldly and objectively. We are living systems shaped by emotion, memory, expectation, attention, and relationship all at once. Even creativity appears tied to emotional states in surprising ways. Studies involving insight and problem solving suggest that relaxed awareness often produces breakthroughs more effectively than intense mental strain. Some of humanity's greatest discoveries emerge during walks, quiet reflection, or moments of emotional openness rather than rigid concentration. When the nervous system relaxes, perception broadens, connections previously hidden become visible. Perhaps consciousness requires spaciousness to reveal its deeper capacities. Modern culture rarely encourages that kind of spaciousness. Speed dominates everything. People consume endless streams of information while rarely processing their emotional experiences fully. Silence becomes uncomfortable because it exposes the internal noise many spend years avoiding. But silence also reveals something else. Underneath the constant mental activity, there is often a quieter awareness observing everything. Thoughts rise and disappear, emotions shift, memories surface and fade. Yet something remains present beneath the movement. Researchers studying meditation and self-awareness practices notice changes in brain regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and self-referential thinking. Long-term practitioners often demonstrated greater emotional stability and reduced stress responses. Not perfection, not emotional numbness, just increased awareness. And awareness changes the relationship we have with experience itself. Fear still appears, but it no longer controls every decision automatically. Anger still exists, but it passes through more consciously. Joy becomes easier to notice. Gratitude feels less forced and more natural. Slowly, the nervous system begins responding differently to life. This may be one of the greatest untapped forms of human potential. Not supernatural power, not mystical escape from reality, something far more grounded and transformative. The ability to consciously influence the quality of our inner state, and through that state influence the way we experience the world around us. Because perhaps the greatest scientific confirmation about human emotion is not merely that feelings affect the body. Perhaps it is that human beings possess far more influence over their internal reality than they were ever taught to believe. And as researchers continue uncovering how consciousness, biology, and perception interact, an even deeper question begins to emerge from the edges of modern science itself. What if the emotional states we cultivate daily are not just reactions to the world we see, but signals shaping the very way reality is interpreted by the mind before experience fully becomes what we call reality? The moment that question is asked seriously, everything becomes more delicate, more uncertain, and strangely more intimate, because it forces us to examine something we usually take for granted, the idea that reality arrives fully formed, and we simply witness it. Yet the more I studied perception research, the more that assumption began to feel incomplete. Neuroscientists often describe perception as a construction process. The brain receives fragments of sensory data, then predicts and assembles a coherent experience in real time. In other words, what we call seeing is not direct recording. It is interpretation layered upon prediction, shaped continuously by memory, expectation, and emotional tone. That means two people can inhabit the same physical environment and still experience entirely different internal worlds. I find that both unsettling and fascinating. Unsettling because it suggests how fragile certainty can be. Fascinating because it reveals how deeply personal reality truly is. Even the smallest shift in emotional state can subtly alter what the brain emphasizes, ignores, or amplifies. A calm mind notices patterns that a stressed mind filters out. A fearful mind interprets ambiguity as threat. A peaceful mind allows ambiguity to remain open. And nothing in that process is accidental. It is adaptive. The brain is always trying to keep us alive, not necessarily to keep us accurate. This distinction matters more than it seems at first glance. Accuracy is not always the priority of perception. Survival is. Emotional systems evolved long before abstract reasoning, meaning that the body often reacts before conscious interpretation catches up. That is why intuition can feel immediate, almost instinctive, even when we cannot explain it logically. But intuition is not magic. It is rapid processing beneath awareness, shaped by previous emotional experience. Still, there is another layer to this story that researchers are only beginning to explore. Some studies in social neuroscience suggest that human brains may synchronize subtly during meaningful interaction. When people engage in deep conversation or emotional connection, their physiological patterns sometimes begin to align. Breathing rhythms, attention cycles, and even neural activity show partial coordination under certain conditions. It almost feels as if communication extends beyond words, as if understanding is not just exchanged, but shared in real time. I remember reflecting on this while observing everyday interactions more closely. A conversation can shift instantly depending on emotional tone. A single moment of empathy can soften tension that language alone could not resolve. And a single misunderstanding can escalate not because of facts, but because of emotional misalignment beneath the surface. This suggests that human connection is not purely intellectual, it is embodied. We feel each other before we analyze each other, and that leads to a deeper realization. If emotion influences perception, and perception influences behavior, then the emotional environment we inhabit daily becomes more important than most people realize. Not in a superficial sense, but in a structural one. It shapes attention, it shapes interpretation, it shapes memory formation. It shapes the decisions we make without consciously recognizing their origin. In that sense, emotional awareness becomes a form of navigation, not control, not suppression. Navigation, the ability to recognize internal weather patterns as they shift. There is a subtle but powerful difference between being overwhelmed by emotion and observing emotion as it arises. One creates identification, the other creates space, and within that space, new responses become possible. This is where psychology begins to overlap with lived experience in a very practical way. People often assume change requires dramatic transformation, but much of the research on behavior suggests that small, consistent shifts in awareness can gradually reshape emotional habits over time. The nervous system learns through repetition. New responses become more accessible when they are practiced gently, repeatedly, without force. Even a brief pause before reacting can interrupt an automatic emotional loop. That pause may seem insignificant, but it is not. It is the moment where awareness enters the process, and awareness changes everything it touches. Yet, even as we explore these findings, a larger mystery remains unresolved. Why does awareness exist in the first place? Why is experience felt rather than simply processed? Why does emotion carry such vivid quality instead of remaining purely informational? Science can describe mechanisms, but the subjective experience itself still resists complete explanation. That gap is not a failure of science, it is an invitation to remain curious. Because every generation of researchers inherits questions that feel unanswerable until new tools, new perspectives, and new ways of thinking expand what is possible to understand. What feels mysterious today may become measurable tomorrow, and what feels certain today may later be revised entirely. This is how knowledge evolves, not through final answers, but through expanding awareness of what questions can be asked. When I step back from the data and look at the broader picture forming across disciplines, something subtle becomes clear. We are beginning to understand human beings not as separate systems of mind and body, but as integrated processes of biology, emotion, perception, and environment interacting continuously. Nothing exists in isolation. Not thought, not feeling, not experience. Everything is relational. And perhaps that is why emotional states feel so significant. They are not just internal events. They are interfaces between the organism and its interpretation of reality. They influence how the world is filtered, how meaning is constructed, and how decisions emerge from complexity. Even now, researchers are developing new ways to measure emotional coherence, cognitive flexibility, and physiological alignment. But measurement alone does not capture the lived experience of what it feels like to shift from inner tension into clarity, or from fragmentation into calm awareness. That transition is subtle, almost invisible at first, yet profoundly transformative when sustained over time. I have often wondered why moments of clarity feel so different from ordinary thinking. There is a sense of openness, as if perception expands beyond its usual boundaries. Time feels less compressed. Thoughts feel less urgent. The body feels more integrated. And then just as quickly, it can fade, as if consciousness itself moves through different modes of organization. Perhaps that is what researchers are indirectly observing when they study attention, emotion, and awareness together, not separate systems competing for control, but a single dynamic field constantly reorganizing itself based on internal and external input. If that is true, then emotional development is not about eliminating difficulty. It is about learning to move through states of experience with greater recognition, flexibility, and understanding. And that brings us back to where we began. The quiet but persistent observation that emotion is not a secondary feature of human life. It is central to how reality is experienced moment by moment. It influences biology, perception, memory, and meaning in ways we are still uncovering. And as research continues to unfold, one final question begins to surface, not as a conclusion, but as a doorway into what has not yet been fully seen or understood about the relationship between consciousness, emotion, and the hidden structure of experience itself that may be far more connected than we ever realized at the beginning of this inquiry. Because once you start following that thread, it becomes difficult to say where consciousness ends and experience begins. The boundary begins to feel less like a line and more like a shifting interface, something responsive rather than fixed. I notice this most clearly in moments of heightened attention, when the mind is both quiet and alert at the same time, as if it is listening rather than thinking. In those moments, perception feels less like interpretation and more like direct contact with reality. Not because the external world has changed, but because the internal noise has temporarily settled enough for subtler details to surface. The texture of experience becomes more noticeable. The space between thoughts becomes more defined. Even ordinary sensations carry a strange clarity, as if they have been there all along, waiting to be seen without distortion. Researchers studying attention networks in the brain have observed something similar. When default mental activity decreases, regions involved in sensory processing and present moment awareness become more coordinated. It is not that thought disappears, but that it stops dominating the entire field of experience. Other forms of intelligence, more immediate and embodied, become easier to detect. That word intelligence begins to feel broader in this context, not limited to reasoning or language, but present in physiological regulation, emotional adaptation, and even subtle shifts in behavior before conscious thought fully forms. The body often knows what the mind has not yet articulated, a tightening in the chest before a difficult decision, a sense of ease when something is aligned, a quiet resistance when something is not. These signals are often dismissed as secondary, yet they may represent a continuous feedback system between perception and internal state. I find it interesting how often we override these signals in favor of abstract reasoning. We learn to trust analysis, logic, and external validation, while gradually becoming less attentive to internal signals that are quieter but constant. Over time, this can create a kind of fragmentation where thinking and sensing drift apart from one another. But when they begin to reintegrate, something shifts. Decisions feel less forced. Reactions become less automatic. There is a subtle sense of coherence returning, as if different layers of experience are no longer competing but communicating. This coherence is not a fixed achievement. It appears and disappears depending on conditions, attention, and emotional state. And perhaps that is what makes it so valuable. It is not a permanent trait, but a dynamic possibility, one that can be cultivated. In laboratory settings, researchers sometimes observe this through variability in physiological rhythms. When a person becomes emotionally overwhelmed, internal systems tend to lose synchrony, heart rhythms become irregular, breathing becomes shallow, attention narrows. But during states of calm engagement or appreciation, these systems often show more stable and coordinated patterns. It is as if the organism is moving between modes of organization, one oriented toward protection and survival, another oriented toward integration and adaptation. Neither mode is inherently good or bad, both are necessary. The question is not how to eliminate stress responses, but how to recognize when they are active and whether they are still appropriate for the present moment. That awareness alone can change the trajectory of experience, because once a state is recognized, it is no longer fully unconscious, and what is no longer unconscious begins to lose some of its automatic control. I have seen this reflected in everyday life in very simple ways. A person pauses before reacting in anger and suddenly notices something beneath the reaction, perhaps fatigue or disappointment or fear that had not been acknowledged. The emotional surface begins to reveal deeper layers. And once those layers are seen, the original reaction often softens on its own. Not through suppression, but through understanding. This is where the research on emotion becomes less about data and more about lived transformation. Because understanding emotional processes is not just intellectual, it changes how experience unfolds in real time. There is also a growing body of research exploring how expectation and attention influence sensory processing itself. When people are told to expect certain stimuli, their brains often respond in advance, preparing sensory regions before the stimulus even arrives. Attention acts like a filter and a lens simultaneously, shaping both what is detected and how it is interpreted. This raises a subtle but profound possibility. If attention shapes perception and emotion shapes attention, then emotional states may indirectly influence what becomes most real to us in experience, not by altering external reality, but by shaping the internal selection process through which reality is constructed. That idea carries weight. Not because it suggests control over the world, but because it suggests responsibility toward inner state as a form of participation in how life is experienced. Still, it is important not to oversimplify this. Life is not purely a projection of emotion. External conditions matter, circumstances matter, biology matters. There are limits to what awareness alone can immediately change. But within those conditions, there appears to be a wide range of variability in how experience is interpreted and integrated. That variability is where human freedom seems to exist, not as absolute control, but as degrees of flexibility. And flexibility may be one of the most overlooked aspects of emotional intelligence, the ability to move between states without becoming trapped in any single one, to feel deeply without collapsing into overwhelm, to think clearly without detaching from emotion, to remain aware while experiencing change. This kind of flexibility does not develop instantly. It emerges gradually through repeated exposure to internal experience without avoidance, through learning to observe rather than immediately react, through allowing emotional states to exist without being defined entirely by them. In this sense, awareness becomes a stabilizing force, not by removing intensity, but by widening the space in which intensity can be held. And within that space, something subtle becomes visible. Emotional states are not static identities. They are processes. They rise, shift, and dissolve. They are influenced by countless factors, many of which operate beneath conscious awareness. When this is seen clearly, identification begins to loosen. A person is no longer simply anxious or calm or stressed as fixed labels. Instead, there is recognition that anxiety is an experience passing through. Calm is a state that can emerge under certain conditions. Stress is a response, not an identity. This shift in perception may seem small, but it alters the relationship with experience profoundly. Because what we no longer mistake for identity becomes easier to observe, and what can be observed more clearly can begin to transform naturally over time. And yet, even as all of this becomes more visible through research and reflection, there remains a sense that we are only at the edge of understanding. Each discovery opens further questions rather than closing them. Each explanation reveals additional layers beneath it. It is almost as if consciousness itself resists final definition, not to hide from inquiry, but to continuously expand the boundaries of what inquiry can reach. And so the investigation continues, moving deeper into the relationship between emotion, perception, and the structures of awareness that quietly shape every moment of human experience, until even the act of observing becomes something far more complex than it first appeared, suggesting that what we are witnessing may not simply be the study of the mind, but something far more interconnected, unfolding at the edge of what we are only beginning to.
When we step back from the emotional narrative and look at the ideas more clearly, a deeper pattern begins to emerge. What the earlier script pointed toward is not a single discovery about emotion, but a convergence of multiple scientific fields, slowly describing the same phenomenon from different angles. Human experience is not passive. It is actively constructed moment by moment through the interaction of emotion, perception, memory, and biology. To understand this in simple terms, think of your mind less like a camera and more like a live interpretation system. A camera records what is in front of it, but your mind does something more complex. It receives incomplete sensory data and immediately begins building meaning. It asks, what is this? Is it safe? Does it matter? Should I pay attention or ignore it? And the surprising part is that emotion plays a major role in answering those questions before conscious reasoning even begins. This is why two people can experience the same situation and walk away with completely different internal realities. The external world is shared, but the interpretation is deeply personal. Neuroscience helps explain why this happens. The brain is constantly predicting reality based on past experience. It does not wait passively for information, it anticipates. Emotion acts like a waiting system in this process. It tells the brain what to prioritize. For example, if someone has been under chronic stress, the brain becomes more sensitive to potential threats. Neutral situations may begin to feel uncertain or even dangerous. On the other hand, when someone is emotionally stable, the same situation may feel manageable or even unremarkable. A simple everyday example is walking into a room after an argument versus walking into the same room after receiving good news. The physical environment has not changed, but your perception of it absolutely has. That shift is emotion shaping perception in real time. One of the most important scientific ideas behind this is neuroplasticity. This refers to the brain's ability to change and reorganize itself based on repeated experience. In practical terms, it means that emotional patterns are not fixed, they are learned, and anything learned can gradually be reshaped. For example, if a person repeatedly reacts to stress with tension and worry, the brain strengthens those pathways. Over time, that reaction becomes more automatic. But if the same person begins to introduce small moments of awareness before reacting, they interrupt that automatic loop. At first, the change is subtle, a slight pause, a breath, a moment of noticing. But over time, that pause becomes powerful because it creates space between stimulus and reaction. That space is where change happens. From a teaching perspective, this is one of the most practical insights modern science offers. You are not your first reaction. You are the awareness that notices the reaction. Now, let's connect this to the body because emotion is never just mental, it is physical. Every emotional state has a biological signature. Stress increases certain hormones. Calm states shift heart rhythm and breathing patterns. Emotional experiences are translated into physiology constantly. A relatable example is how your breathing changes without effort when you feel safe versus when you feel anxious. You do not decide to breathe differently. The body responds automatically. This shows that emotion and biology are deeply intertwined systems, not separate processes. This is also why emotional regulation is not about suppressing feelings. It is about learning how to guide the system back into balance. Simple actions like slowing the breath, relaxing the jaw, or softening the shoulders send signals back to the nervous system that influence emotional state. The body and mind are in constant communication. Another key idea from the script is that attention shapes perception. What you focus on becomes more mentally real, not because other things disappear, but because the brain filters information based on relevance. Emotion strongly influences what feels relevant. For example, when someone is anxious, the mind tends to scan for problems. When someone feels grateful or safe, the mind becomes more open to subtle details and possibilities. This is why emotional state can influence creativity, decision making, and even memory. In daily life, this explains why problems often feel bigger at night or during stress. The mind is narrowing focus onto concerns. The situation itself has not changed, but the filter has. So, what can we do with this understanding in a practical way? The first step is awareness, not trying to fix anything immediately, but learning to notice emotional states as they arise. This is often more powerful than people expect. The simple act of noticing creates distance between you and the emotion. Instead of being inside the reaction, you begin observing it. A practical way to develop this is to pause briefly during emotional shifts and silently label what is happening. Not judging it, just recognizing it. Tension, frustration, worry, excitement, calm. This labeling engages higher level awareness in the brain and reduces automatic reactivity. The second step is regulation through the body. Since emotion is physical, working with the body directly can shift emotional states. Slow breathing is one of the simplest tools. When breathing slows and deepens, it signals safety to the nervous system. This does not eliminate problems, but it stabilizes the internal state, so clearer thinking becomes possible. Another useful practice is posture awareness. When the body is collapsed or tense, emotional states often follow. When posture is open and grounded, the mind tends to reflect that stability. This is not psychological theory alone, it is a feedback loop between body and emotion. The third step is reflection after experience. Instead of moving immediately from one moment to the next, taking even a few minutes at the end of the day to review emotional patterns can build long term awareness. The goal is not analysis but recognition. When did stress appear? What triggered it? How did the body respond? Over time, this builds emotional intelligence in a very practical sense. What all of this points toward is a simple but profound understanding. Emotional life is not something happening to you in isolation. It is a continuous interaction between internal states and external reality. And while we cannot control every circumstance, we can gradually become more aware of how those circumstances are interpreted within us. The deeper meaning behind these ideas is not about control or perfection. It is about relationship. Relationship with your own mind, your body, and the experience unfolding in each moment. When that relationship becomes clearer, life does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes more understandable. And in that understanding, there is often a quiet sense of stability that does not depend on external conditions. What science is revealing step by step is that human experience is far more dynamic than we once assumed. Emotion is not noise in the system, it is part of the system itself. And by learning to observe it, work with it, and understand it more deeply, we begin to participate in our own inner architecture in a more conscious way. And as this understanding continues to develop, it naturally leads to a final open question that researchers and thinkers are still exploring today. If perception, emotion, and biology are so deeply intertwined, then what does it truly mean to experience reality itself from the inside out?